This video is brought to you by Atlas VPN.
Who is that masked man on the Dave Rubin Report? This mysterious figure is the anarchist and underwear model Michael Malice. Have you seen this man before? He's one of the world's most prominent anarchists.
Being an anarchist, like I'm probably one of the most prominent ones.
He put out a book on anarchism recently that at first seems like a pretty legit compilation of anarchist thought with a cool anarcho-vaporwave cover, until you click on the link to the Anarchist Handbook on Audible, and I promise you that what you see there will literally make you say out loud, huh? Lauren Chen, Dave Rubin, Tim Pool? This is a book on anarchy with essays from radical leftists through history, read entirely by right-wing personalities and the guy from My Name is Earl? What is happening? At first, I thought Michael Malice must be a fringe, little-known character frequenting only the most shadowy anarchist bars and bookstores, but to my surprise, he's everywhere, spreading his message of anarchy, appearing on podcasts and shows hosted by Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, Blair White, Tim Pool, Michael Knowles, Glenn Beck, Jesse Lee Peterson. Who is he and what does he want from us?
Why do you think you have such a hold over the online right political sphere? Because you're not a right-winger, you're an anarchist.
Also, I know what you're thinking. His name's Michael Malice. What is he, a comic book character? That's the thing. Literally, yes. Michael Malice got his career start by appearing in the beloved underground comics writer Harvey Pekar's book, Ego and Hubris. But through black magic, he somehow escaped the ink and paper world of the comic book page and now walks the earth as flesh and bone. Either that or he was always real and Harvey Pekar just made a graphic biography of him. I didn't look it up, but whichever it is, he definitely does exist now, and he's definitely one of the world's most prominent anarchists. Everything I learn about this guy pulls me further into his web. It's like finding out Fritz the Cat wrote a book on intersectional feminism narrated by Kevin Samuels. Fascinating guy. He seems to be fairly well known by the right, but I've never heard him get mentioned by leftists. I decided to finally do a deep dive from a left perspective into the beliefs of this strange man. Let's start that journey now.
But first, some sponsored content. This video is brought to you by Atlas VPN. Click the special link in the description box below or the pinned comment to get access to Atlas VPN's special deal for 82% off. That's a lot of percent to have off. When you're surfing the information superhighway, data is coming at you in a box on a conveyor belt from another country. That's how it works. This leaves it open to be attacked or used by little monster guys, symbolizing hackers, government, advertisers, and internet service providers. With a VPN, you block your data from being seen by these monster guys, and they are too confused to even understand what's happening. Okay, staying safe online is pretty cool, but can I use Atlas VPN to save money? Well, that's a very specific question, but yes, you can actually. The price of a bunch of online stuff changes based on where in the world you are. Atlas VPN allows you to pick from servers all over the world and pay the local cost, saving you tons of money on subscription services like Spotify, Netflix, and Premium. This is pretty cool. When you open it up, Atlas VPN shows you all the evil guys trying to get into your computer, and when you switch it on, this little friend comes in and saves the day.
It's the eternal battle between chaos and order, the serpent and the cosmic dream mother, the little monster guys and the Atlas VPN mascot. Western masculinity.
You know how dangerous the internet can be. You're on it right now. You also know how cool and important having a VPN is because I just told you. How much would a thing like this probably cost, you think? Like, I don't know, probably at least $2 a month, right? That's where you're wrong. Right now, Atlas VPN is running a huge discount. It means you can get a 3-year subscription for just $1.99 a month with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Time is running out, so get your deal by clicking the link in the video description below.
Okay, now let's learn about this Michael Malice character, shall we? Come along with me.
Ego and Hubris, an American Splendor story. I think we should start by checking out that Harvey Pekar book. It's a weird book, but pretty interesting. Well-structured, art by Gary Dumb. Let me pick up a copy.
And Harvey ended up writing a book about me, which now goes for $500 on eBay, if you can believe it.
If a book's that expensive, you know it's going to be good. Either that or it's out of print. I don't know. One of those. Luckily, I was able to procure a legal copy of it from a legal place somewhere. It's called Ego and Hubris, and this seems to be because Michael Malice spends most of the book reminding you of how smart he is. Seriously, over and over again, he's like, I'm the smartest guy in my nursery school. I'm the smartest guy in kindergarten. I'm the smartest guy in high school. I'm the smartest guy in my college. I'm smarter than my teachers. I'm smarter than my professors. I'm the smartest guy in the smart guy lounge at the Smart Factory. He claims he has a 160 IQ, which is very impressive. That's higher than 99.997% of the population. I don't know those stats because I'm smart or anything. I only know that because his character in the book specified. This weird thing happens that I'm just going to show here out of context. He does talk about being an anarchist, though. Does he mention any anarchist philosophers he gets inspiration from? No, not really, though he does mention Ayn Rand, like a lot.
I'm from the Ayn Rand school.
I own her copy of the first printing of the Fountainhead. So that should tell you a little bit about how my affection for Miss Rand.
The book even ends with an inspirational Ayn Rand quote. I didn't even know they made those. Shoot for the moon. Even if you miss, you'll just have proved yourself a weak and inferior man.
There's this great book called Atlas Shrugged, and the author posits an anarchist private society. She calls it Galt's Gulch, where everything is privately owned and no one is in a position of authority over anyone else other than the landowner.
Despite what Malice says there, Ayn Rand was not an anarchist. For someone calling themselves an anarchist to mention Ayn Rand so often is a bit of a red flag. Actually, it's not a red flag at all. It's more of a yellow flag. Keep that in mind. I'll explain in a second. Red and yellow flags? What am I doing? Kicking some guy out of a soccer game? No. I hung up my whistle and shorts years ago. I just couldn't bury any more of my friends. Michael Malice also had an oddly spiritual connection to a place called the Cato Institute, a right-wing libertarian think tank. When he sees the place during a trip to DC, there's this hilarious scene.
When we were on the mall in DC, I left the group and started walking around. DC is a very tiny place, like an oasis in the desert. I came on Cato, and like an oasis, there were palm trees growing in the lobby. It was Saturday, so the building was closed, but I just walked up to it and snapped a picture. I felt like Moses after hearing the burning bush, as if I had this profound vision of the sublime.
A fascinating subversion of the classical depiction of the sublime, typically represented as a man on top of a mountain staring out onto a sea of fog, contemplating its incalculable vastness. Here we see Michael Malice having this same experience while peering into the empty lobby of a right-wing think tank that wants to privatize NASA. Truly awe-inspiring. The most you really hear about his anarchy beliefs is when he's called into jury duty and he says he should be allowed to leave because he's an anarchist and doesn't recognize the authority of the judge or the state. Everyone is really impressed by him and how smart he is, as usual, the most constant thing in his life. But eventually they decide, even though he's an anarchist, he's too smart to not be a part of the jury. I'm sure this story really happened in real life. So you might have figured it out by now if you read the spoilers in the video title. I don't know why you would ruin it for yourself like that, but anyway, Michael Malice is not an anarchist. He's an anarcho-capitalist. Look, we've stumbled upon one of the rarest chud types to dunk, the anarcho-capitalist. The ANCAP believes in a truly ridiculous ideology that is only superficially related to real anarchism. Okay, hang on. I know there's a big chunk of my viewers who already know what I'm talking about, but for those of you who don't, let me briefly explain some terms so we can all enjoy how wrong Michael Malice is about stuff together. Anarchism and Anarcho-capitalism, a crash course. Anarchy can sound pretty scary if you're new to it, which is why I'm recommending anarchists lose that spooky jagged circle A in favor of a more pleasant symbol, like this little fella, Anarchy, the anarchist narwhal. They're just a cute little long-toothed whale that loves sharing with their friends, making sure everyone's concerns are heard, and yes, sure, maybe sometimes, when it's necessary, putting on a black mask and lighting a cop car on. What is anarchy? Well, anarchy is a tough concept to boil down, but very basically, you can think of it as being against any and all unjust hierarchies. The hierarchy of the state over its subjects is a big one, but also the hierarchy of the rich over the poor, men over women, Team Edward over Team Jacob, all of that. These hierarchies, according to anarchists, are fundamentally harmful and exploitative and must be done away with as much as possible. Abolishing all unjustified hierarchies is the goal of anarchism, to create a world based on mutual aid, helping one another to live our best lives. A world without patriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism, or socioeconomic class divides, where everyone gets everything they need. Anarchy isn't chaotic, it's organized. The circle A stands for anarchy is order. No hierarchy doesn't necessarily mean there'd be no government, but it would have to be a completely different, unrecognizable one. A direct democracy controlled from the bottom up by the people who are actually affected by its decisions. We live in what anarchists call a horizontally structured society. Anarchy is democracy taken seriously. It's also more than a vision of a world that doesn't exist but could one day. It's a process anarchists can begin right now by volunteering in their community, working at a shelter, engaging in direct action, listening to folk punk, keeping 5 to 10 bikes by the front door of their apartments, and doing what they can to reduce the oppressive power of unjustified authority. Even if the state and capitalism aren't abolished, the methods and impulses of anarchism can be used to improve any non-anarchist society. It's not about the destination, it's about the journey. Although the destination does sound nice. So does Michael Malice fit my definition? Is he an anarchist?
So yeah, this anarchy thing, like how serious are you about that?
100% serious.
100% serious.
Yes.
Words change, languages transform. What meant one thing a couple hundred years ago might mean a very different thing today, and it's silly to gatekeep people who have clearly found a label they're comfortable with, is what I would say in almost any other circumstance. But no, Malice is an anarcho-capitalist, which is not the same thing.
The slogan I have is the black flag comes in many colors.
Or the black flag comes in many colors. Except that the black flag comes in many colors. I really like that quote. I'm very proud of myself for that quote.
Yes, Michael, that is a good quote. It's true. The black flag does come in many colors, but the full quote really should specify that the black flag comes in many colors, but definitely not yellow. That's the anarchist's capitalist color. What do ANCAPs have in common with anarchists? Let's do the full list. Okay, number 1, they want to abolish the state. That's the whole list. I really thought there would be more, but while ANCAPs definitely hate the state, they think other forms of hierarchy are fine. Good, even.
So anarchism just means not having a belief in the state and believing as well that a voluntary society, a peaceful society, is the optimal one.
This isn't just a no true Scotsman fallacy. The idea of an ideology that is both anarchist and pro-capitalist doesn't even make grammatical sense. It's like saying you're an instrumental vocalist, or a barefoot shoe model, or a bad book by Terry Pratchett. You know? It just doesn't make sense. Capitalism, of course, is an economic system that automatically places people into an extremely hierarchical class structure, which itself reinforces and often creates other hierarchies like gender, race, and sexuality. Existing and trying to survive under the structures and motivations of capitalism makes hypocrites of us all. On an unrelated note, subscribe to my Patreon. If I meet my stretch goal this month, I'll be able to buy myself food. Let me explain anarcho-capitalism in a different way. Let's say you're being attacked by a swarm of hierarchical animals, like lobsters. And in that situation, you'd probably be like, I need to get rid of these lobsters. I am against all lobsters pinching me with their tiny little claws. And then there's another guy there who's like, dude, I totally agree with you. All right? We are on the same page. We need to get rid of that one specific lobster there. That one. That's the bad one. And then you're like, okay, it doesn't sound like we really agree, because I was kind of hoping we could get all of these evil lobsters off of the biting and pinching of me. And he's like, no, man, you don't understand. The lobsters are good. It's just that one evil lobster that's getting in the way. If we could get rid of that, then me and all the other lobsters could pinch you in a much more efficient way. And then you're like, well, that sounds like a much worse situation for me. I don't think we agree. And he goes, no, we have the exact same ideology, actually, if you think about it. Well, that guy sounds pretty weird, right? You'd say that? You'd agree? Well, guess what? That guy from the hypothetical, he represents anarcho-capitalists. Burn. So, ANCAPs want to abolish the state, pretty much like libertarians, and they're against state power over business, kind of like neoliberals. Yes and yes. In fact, these three ideologies are very similar in my opinion, the greatest difference being how honest they are about all the end results of their horrible worldview. Neoliberals are like, deregulation and privatization will allow the laissez-faire free market to lift everyone out of poverty. Libertarians are like, the less control the state has in our lives, the more liberty we'll all have. And ANCAPs are like, hello, I'd like Elon Musk to have his own standing army, please. So, while they're all basically alike and in the same category, neoliberals and libertarians are doing pretty well in the world. Neoliberalism is, of course, the dominant political and economic ideology of planet Earth right now. Both US political parties, all three or two of Canadian political parties, and it's been adopted either by corporate politicians or by force on essentially every country on Earth. Libertarians, I mean, they're kind of a joke, but they do have representation. They've got, U.S. elected representatives, some famous podcast hosts, and one of the best characters from Parks and Recreation. Also, at least 3 guys I've gotten into political arguments with at house parties. Like, they're out there. It's safe to say that ANCAPs are not doing nearly as well as their 2 big brothers, despite Malice's confidence about the libertarian to anarchist pipeline.
Libertarians and
Sure.
anarchists.
Sure.
Where do they differ?
6 months.
6 months. That's the joke, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here's something interesting. Libertarian actually once referred to libertarian socialists, who are real anarchists or those right next to real anarchists on the political compass. Outside of the US and Canada, though, libertarian still mostly does mean that. This was a word deliberately stolen from the left. Does that sound conspiratorial? It does, kind of. But here's a quote from a guy we'll talk about more a little later named Murray Rothbard, one of the original anarcho-capitalists.
One gratifying aspect of our rise to some prominence is that, for the first time in my memory, we, our side, had captured a crucial word from the enemy. Libertarians had long been simply a polite word for left-wing anarchists. That is, for anti-private property anarchists, either of the communist or syndicalist variety. But now we had taken it over, and more properly, from the view of etymology, since we were proponents of individual liberty and therefore of the individual's right to his property.
Yeah, this guy steals words. He made a plan to steal a word and then carried out that word heist. Imagine doing that. Truly Disney villain behavior. No word or phrase shall escape our evil grasp. Next, we're going to change the meaning of group session bukkake to mean fiscal conservatism. Yeah. It seems like anarcho-capitalists are attempting a similar word heist with the term anarchy, although it's not clear to me that that's a good strategy for them. You guys really think people will listen to your horrible ideas if you call yourselves anarchists? That doesn't even work when your ideas are actually good. People are surprisingly down with a lot of anarchist stuff until you mention the name of the ideology, and then everyone gets really weird, and later your girlfriend tells you you need to be less intense around her friends, and she loves you, but could you please dial it back? It's fine when the two of you are alone, but just not in those certain social situations, because you've got to remember, not everyone agrees with you and all your little friends on Twitter. You understand, right? Well, for this reason, ANCAPs aren't one of the more important chud types we could be going after today, but they sure are one of the most hilarious. If I can't make fun of ANCAPs, I don't want to be in your revolution. So just sit back, grab a cool or hot beverage, or no beverage, whatever you want, whatever you're feeling, and let's all just learn so much about this one friggin' guy. Michael Malice's anarcho-strategy. Hey, boo-boo. Michael Malice is smarter than your average ANCAP. Remember, he was the most intelligent guy in his nursery school class by far. And as far as I know, he is the only ANCAP to ever have won $675 on Cash Cab.
All right, well, congratulations. You guys won $675 in the Cash Cab.
So he's got to have a better strategy to spread his bad ideas, right? Well, he does, actually. I gotta give him credit. It's a better plan than you might expect. Here's the thing. Michael Malice has never once called himself an anarcho-capitalist. At least, I've never heard him do it, and his Wikipedia page says he calls himself an anarchist without adjectives. The black flag comes in many colors, but Michael Malice doesn't see color.
So how is it that you, a right-winger, quite firmly on the right, how do you reconcile that this movement that came largely from the left is now the movement you'd identify with?
Well, I don't know that I would call myself firmly on the right, but I think also this is an example of when labels and binary thinking fault people.
His compilation, The Anarchist Handbook, contains many completely contradictory essays from both real anarchists and anarcho-capitalists. When called out on this, he says,
I do own your book. There are conflicting essays on private properties. What is your position? I like them all.
No, they're conflicting in that they disagree on whether private property should be abolished or if you should be allowed to be a feudal lord. You can't like them both. Michael Malice is known for being a troll, so there's no reason to take him at his word on this. His ANCAP views will become obvious. Let's go through his book, The Anarchist Handbook, starting with the introduction written by him, where he goes over his personal definition of anarchy. Michael's definition of anarchy. If you've seen an interview where Michael Malice talks at all about anarchy, you've probably heard a good 50% of the things he writes in this intro. Malice has done all the right-wing talk shows, and people are usually pretty skeptical about anarchy. Isn't that like the thing Antifa does?
Yeah, and I know that my audience, just to clarify, the reason why I think this is a weird conversation is we tend to not like the word anarchist, and I know that you know that.
Your answer to this is a very naughty word. Anarchism.
Freedom?
People that are conservative, immediately they react, and when they hear anarchist, they just go bad.
Most people think of an anarchist and they think of the black flag and they think of the morons up in Portland that are just setting things on fire.
It's a problem anyone who calls themselves an anarchist has. Anticipating this, Malice has come up with a bunch of quick slogans that describe his anarchism in a way that's designed to be palatable even to someone who's a little afraid of the idea. They're snappy, they're catchy, they're the type of thing you can imagine stitched into some embroidery at your libertarian grandma's house, hanging just over the unregistered AR-15 and the stack of Doomsday Prepper food buckets. This is one of the things I would really say Michael Malice does well. Many people he talks to end up agreeing with him.
The fact that not only would I end up wanting to intentionally invite somebody with anarchist views on my show, but that I would like him.
Michael, you are, seriously, I say this sincerely, one of the most intelligent people out there in the right-wing media today.
Just, do you believe in these things? If you do, I'm in.
Well, that's the anarchist principle, so welcome to anarchism, Glenn.
You haven't convinced me on anarchism yet, but we'll have to save that for next time, perhaps.
My criticisms of his snappy anarchism explanations are that they're more than a little vague, and in some cases I'd also say dishonest, but the fact remains, they work to get people on his side. Let's go over Michael Malice's elevator pitch for anarchy.
What is an anarchist exactly?
An anarchist is someone who believes you do not speak for me. And he goes, can you give me the elevator pitch for anarchism? I said, you do not speak for me. There you go.
In one sense, anarchism is nothing more than a declaration that you do not speak for me. Everything else is just implementation.
Michael Malice speaks on behalf of all anarchists when he says they really hate it when people speak on their behalf. I'll admit this is an intriguing way to present the idea. It gets people thinking. It got me thinking. I've never heard before that anarchy just means saying, you do not speak for me. Being generous here, It lines up with the distrust of authority, maybe speaks to the preferable anarchist method of direct democracy where everyone affected by a decision gets a say in it. Of course, speaking on your behalf is far from the worst thing a person in authority can do to you, so I don't know. I still think the best way to open a real discussion about anarchy is to focus directly on the opposition to all unjustified hierarchies. It just gives people a better idea of what anarchism's about. I will admit, the sentence, abolish all unjustified hierarchies, is not nearly as cool and casual as saying, you do not speak for me. Maybe something like, you gotta get those out of there, those unjustified hierarchies. You gotta get them on down, out of here. Something like that. Or maybe like, you're not my real dad, would be quicker. I'm not sure if that would... we can do this. Something like, who made you the boss of me? He's also sounded like kind of like something a kid would say. Okay, I don't know. We'll workshop it, you know?
Anarchism isn't a location, it's a relationship.
So anarchism isn't a location, it's a relationship. Anarchism is not a location. Anarchism is a relationship, one in which none of the parties has authority over the other.
This one, I gotta admit, I actually kind of like. Too often, critiques of anarchy boil down to asking where it has been successfully applied, you know, the location, and then pointing out flaws with that or ways it didn't live up to a utopian ideal and dismissing the ideology altogether. Sure, Makhnovshina was not perfect, but perfection's a pretty high bar to judge any organization by, even one that didn't get red-weddinged by Trotsky. If anarchy is a relationship, it's something you can practice in your life. You can have an anarchist relationship with your partner, where neither is above the other and both share the work. You can have an anarchist relationship with your coworkers, and you can unionize your workplace to at least lessen the power gap between you and your boss. A relationship isn't the only thing anarchy can be, but it's a way to live anarchist values in everyday life, even while we still live in a rigidly hierarchical world, and even if we don't consider ourselves anarchists. So yeah, so far, I like this one, but what does Malice actually mean about the anarchist relationship?
Every nation is in an anarchist relationship with one another. Every country is in a state of anarchy towards every other country, right? So if a Canadian kills an American in Mexico, so what happens if a Canadian kills an American in Mexico? I have no idea. I bet you don't have an idea. If a Canadian kills an American in Mexico, there is some agreed upon mechanism to adjudicate the situation without involving a higher authority, because there is no higher authority to invoke.
I find it so funny that he uses the same example constantly about a murderous Canadian on an American killing trip to Mexico, and he always says there's some agreed upon way to deal with that. He never explains what that way is. What would happen? I've heard the hypothetical enough times. I'd love to know. You know, you can't give me the inciting incident and then walk away before the resolution. I'd love to know what happened in the mysterious case of the U.S. tourist found in a Tulum hotel room bathtub, dead, with his lungs full of high-quality maple syrup. Ay, que rica muerte! I want you to think about what Malice is saying here, about what this says about Malice's worldview. Michael Malice, he calls himself an anarchist. He says anarchy is a relationship, but what is that relationship, according to him? Apparently it's the same type of relationship as countries have with each other. What do you think? Write your answer down, fold it in half, put it in an envelope, and seal it shut. Place the envelope under your seat. Now, look in your back left pocket. Was that your card? Statistically, some of you have a card in your pocket, and I just did a great job at magic. Anyway, we'll come back to Michael Malice's Anarchy of Countries later. Let's look into the other essays Malice included in his book. Bakunin. So Malice includes a section from Mikhail Bakunin, and it's pretty obvious why this specific piece was chosen. It's a critique of Marx and authoritarian communism in general. As Malice says in the short introduction to the essay,
Marx's foremost ideological rival was Mikhail Bakunin. At the time, there was an enormous debate as to whether communism should be achieved through the state, the Marxist position, or Bakunin's view that anarchism was the way. 50 years before the Soviet Union was founded, Bakunin was anticipating and recounting what the theory of Marxism would mean in practice.
Believe it or not, Marxists and anarchists have been arguing since the very start of their existence, long before Twitter was introduced. Proudhon, originator of the term anarchism, was engaged in a beef with Marx, where Proudhon's philosophy of poverty was followed up with Marx's hilariously titled diss essay, Poverty of Philosophy. If you're wondering, there is a Proudhon chapter in the Anarchist Handbook, and the audiobook version is read by Tim Pool.
Tim Pool for the Mutualist, your voice selections are on point. I liked it because it was memoirs of a revolutionist. So like Tim Pool being the revolutionist, that was pretty funny.
Bakunin and Marx also butted heads. Bakunin criticized Marx for his love of the state, for using terms like workers' state or dictatorship of the proletariat, which Bakunin thought would be used later to justify brutal authoritarian regimes, using Marx's words for legitimacy.
Like, when people are being beaten with a stick, they're not much happier if it's called the people's stick. Duh.
Now, Marx was a very smart guy, and one of history's few economists worthy of any respect. Even Bakunin called him a genius, and was himself inspired by Marx's critiques of capital. But that doesn't mean there's no room for critique and disagreement. Personally, I think the critiques of Marx with the most substance tended to come from other socialists, certainly not from capitalists or fascists. I'd rather read a critique of Marx from an anarchist or Marxist than from some Fox News or New York Post contributor who doesn't even have a working definition of what communism is. So it's pretty interesting that when it came time to select someone for the audiobook recording of the Bakunin chapter, Malice chose Carol Markowitz, a Fox News New York Post contributor who doesn't have a working definition of what communism is. It must have been fun for her to read this chapter for the audiobook and communicate a good argument against communism for the first time in her career. Honestly, it sucks to see this Bakunin stuff in a book written for people on the right, because however much Bakunin disagreed with Marx, I'm sure he'd disagree far more with Michael Malice and his fan base of weirdo right libertarians. Besides, the right doesn't even need real critiques of communism. Conservatives just gobble up everything that falls out of the mouth hole of even a dipshit as ignorant as Mark Levin going on about the Franklin School. They clap and cheer, listening to professional ass clown James Lindsay babble utter nonsense about how CRT is Marxist and also grooming. In short, they are severely deprived of good arguments against Marxism, and they don't even realize or care. But it does turn out when they get a good argument from an anarcho-socialist like Bakunin, they kind of love it.
All the people who are libertarians who read this, the one essay they love the most is by Michael Bakunin from 1867.
But I had been under the impression that Bakunin was really the sort of father of Antifa, the whole father of ideological, like anarcho-communism. But then Malice, that selection doesn't really convey that.
And his essay, 50 years before the Soviet Union, said, this is what Marxism is going to mean in practice. This is why it's a nightmare 1,000 times worse than the Tsar. You guys are crazy. You guys are evil. This is not what we're about. He called it. It's all in here.
His essay, more so than anyone else, just blew me away because I wasn't expecting anything. I go, all right, here's the Antifa nonsense. Let's hear it. And it was brilliant. And I go, my God, you poor morons have strayed so far from what could be something great.
I love that he pronounces Mikhail Bakunin's name Michael Bakunin there. You can't just add your own name to someone else's. Yeah, my favorite anarchist theorist is probably Peter Kropotkin. Emma Goldman. Malice has said on record several times that one of his favorite people in all of history is the anarcho-communist Emma Goldman.
And the three I can think off the top of my head who are all in my top 10 heroes of all time are Emma Goldman.
Which is definitely a pretty respectable choice for a favorite person because Emma Goldman kind of rules. Like Michael Malice, she was born in Eastern Europe and immigrated to New York. She was an atheist, gay rights activist, feminist, and early birth control advocate all the way back in the late 19th, early 20th century when these views were even more scandalous. She was arrested many times. Once a police interrogator told her he would let her go if she told him who else was involved in the crime. She said she'd think about it and asked for a glass of water, and when he brought it to her, she immediately threw it in his face. One of Emma's mentors in anarchism was Johann Most, who advocated something called propaganda of the deed. Emma and her husband decided to advocate for anarchism and terrorize the capitalist class by having her husband do a deed of assassinating an anti-union capitalist, and then Emma would propagandize about it, which does seem in retrospect to be a very bad plan. Despite shooting his target 3 times and stabbing him once, the capitalist survived the attack and her husband was put in prison. When Johann Most criticized the pair for this, Emma brought a toy horsewhip over to one of Most's speeches, threatened him with it, and then broke it over her knee and threw the pieces at him. She was an excellent and engaging public speaker, maybe a bit too engaging, as her speeches about anarchy apparently inspired one confused man to do some propaganda of the deed of his own and assassinate the president of the US in 1901. At various times, she lived in cities around the world, including my city, Toronto, where she helped develop the local anarchist movement. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover once called her the most dangerous woman in the world. Anyway, she did a lot in her life, but Malice likes her for one very specific reason: what she said about Lenin and the USSR. So, much like Bakunin provides Malice with an anti-Marxist message from before the USSR existed, Goldman's disillusionment in Russia provides more cover for Malice and anyone who might accuse him of being a communist sympathizer.
They're like, oh, you want socialism? Because at the time, the anarchists were regarded as socialists. She got deported to the Soviet Union, went to Lenin's office, and she goes, this isn't what we're about. The revolution is about the individual and free speech and everyone working together to further society. This is worse than the Tsar.
I was on Breitbart earlier this week. Alex Marlow, who's great, he was reading a whole section of Emma Goldman on Breitbart.
No, I'm an anarchist, and anarchists are actually the most against communism. Just ask my favorite person, Emma Goldman, the anarcho-communist. All right, we're going to move on in a second, but there's one last thing. But please, I want you to savor this moment, these last few seconds where you don't know the person Michael Malice chose to read the Emma Goldman section for the audiobook. It was Mikhail Peterson, the lobster daughter of acclaimed transphobe and public crier Jordan B. Peterson, who has said that she's opposed to female birth control, although I think she would probably change her mind if scientists could make a morning after pill made entirely out of beef. Peter Kropotkin. Oh, taking bread tube back to its roots over here. That's right. Malice includes a section from The Conquest of Bread by the original bread man himself, anarcho-communist Santa Claus, Peter Kropotkin. People sometimes call leftist YouTube BreadTube, which is a reference to the title of this book. Now, don't judge him too harshly for that association. He wasn't around to approve of it all and can't be blamed for it in any way. Chapter 6, Concerning the Importance of the Debate, Bro Streamer. In all seriousness, I want to quickly mention that while Conquest of Bread is a great book that clearly outlines Kropotkin's argument for why anarcho-communism is necessary and his vision of what an anarcho-communist world might look like, it's also just one book, and it was written 130 years ago. I feel like it's sometimes considered to be the go-to infallible Bible at the top of the hierarchy of anarchist texts. But, saying at this point that Conquest of Bread is your favorite anarchist book is kind of like saying your favorite movie is Avengers Infinity War. If you really want to get a well-rounded view of what anarchism is, you should read the Bread book, and also read a diverse variety of other anarchist theory, and probably some stuff that was written a little bit more recently than the Bread book by Peter Kropotkin. Something like Mutual Aid by Peter Kropotkin. Then you'll be an expert. Unlike the section on Bakunin, Malice shows Kropotkin at his most communist, printing an excerpt of The Conquest of Bread, where Kropotkin openly and proudly talks about how much he loves communism.
Ho, ho, ho! Every society which has abolished private property will be forced, we maintain, to organize itself on the lines of communistic anarchy. Anarchy leads to communism and communism to anarchy, both alike being expressions of the predominant tendency in modern societies, the pursuit of equality.
After reading the whole Kropotkin section, I gotta say, I'm confused. With Emma Goldman and Bakunin, it seemed like there was a right-wing ideological reason for posting the sections he did. Malice could have easily made Kropotkin look bad by selecting some parts in the Bread book that don't hold up in the light of our modern, late-stage capitalist world, but Malice actually selected two of the best parts, which are least compatible with a right-wing anarcho-capitalist view. One section about how great anarcho-communism is, and another section about how bad capitalism is. That second section, actually legitimately one of my favorite passages of the whole book. It explores the inherent flaws in capitalism by telling a few short stories of people from various classes in society and how they could each make themselves rich through a combination of hard work and merciless exploitation of the poor. A concept that has aged depressingly well after more than a century. It's so good. In fact, maybe this is a wild idea, but I'm just thinking of this right now, by the way. But, it would be all right if we took a short break from Malice and heard from a real anarchist for a bit. Is that okay with you? Yeah? Okay, cool. There was nobody there. I don't know why I don't know why I looked.
Ho, ho, ho! Those who dismiss anarcho-communism have never paused to inquire whence come the fortunes of the rich. A little thought would, however, suffice to show them that these fortunes have their beginnings in the poverty of the poor. When there are no longer any destitute,
there will no longer be any rich to exploit them.
Welcome back to Making Lots of Money in a Capitalist World, the only game show where all the contestants are made up by a Russian guy from another century. Let's meet our contestants. Our first entrepreneur, ready to pull himself up by his bootstraps, is a feudal baron in the Middle Ages who came into possession of a fertile valley. My, that valley sure looks fertile. I bet you'd just love to use that fertile valley to make yourself a lot of money, am I right? But oh no, there's nobody living in this valley to work it for you, making it useless. As my co-host Kropotkin might say,
he might as well possess a property in the moon.
Oh dear, our friend the feudal baron is in a real tough spot. Is there anything he can do to make himself a bunch of money? Anything aside from doing any labor himself? There we go. Looks like the Baron's decided to use one of his lifelines, exploiting the very poor. Go ahead and invite all the poorest peasants you can find to live on the land and work it for you. Kropotkin, tell the audience how this lifeline works.
There are thousands of destitute persons ruined by wars or drought or pestilence. They have neither horse nor plow. All these destitute creatures are trying to better their condition. So the poor wretches swarm over the Baron's lands, making roads, draining marshes, building villages. In 9 years, he begins to tax them. 5 years later, he increases the rent. Then he doubles it. The peasant accepts these new conditions because he cannot find better ones elsewhere. And little by little, with the aid of laws made by the barons, the poverty of the peasant becomes the source of the landlord's wealth. But the peasant has nothing, so he will accept any conditions, if only he can keep body and soul together while he tills the soul and enriches the landlord.
You might want to make it sound more exciting next time, Kropotkin. Anyway, let's go ahead and meet contestant number 2, who is a middle-class citizen living in Kropotkin's modern day who's recently come into possession of a fairly large sum of money. I can see you're practical-minded, and you invested that money in a factory which you've staffed with, in Kropotkin's words, needy wretches whose children clamor for bread. Very smart play, contestant number 2, and congratulations. By paying them as little as you can get away with, you're going to be able to expand the factory and become extremely wealthy. Our final contestant this evening is a true self-made man, a poor shoemaker who realizes if he continues earning like he's been, he'll have no money to retire and worse, nothing to leave for his son. Aww, right? You've saved as much money as you could and you've hired a young man to work as an apprentice. And you've chosen well because this young apprentice is so desperate and without prospects, he'll eagerly work for almost nothing in exchange for learning the cobbler's trade. By managing his finances, the shoemaker here was able to hire more apprentices, then eventually a few paid workers, who you also pay as little as possible, and netted for yourself a profit far greater than you ever could have made working on your own. Congratulations! Well, folks, we don't usually see this many winners in one group because capitalism doesn't create a whole lot of winners, but tonight we've got a wealthy landowning baron, a middle-class factory owner, and a poor shoemaker who all figured out that one weird trick of making lots of money in a capitalist world. Making a fortune in business is most possible if you're lucky enough to have very poor and desperate people available. Thanks for tuning in. Kropotkin, play us out with some righteous anger and maybe a little bit of hope.
9/10 of the great fortunes made in the United States are the result of knavery on a large scale. In Europe, 9/10 of the fortunes made in our monarchies and republics have the same origin. There are not two ways of becoming a millionaire. At bottom, it is nothing more nor less than grinding the face of the poor. We wish to give to the workers all those things the lack of which makes them fall an easy prey to the exploiter, that not a single man shall be forced to sell the strength of his right arm to obtain a bare subsistence for himself and his babes. This will be our duty during the revolution, for whose coming we look, not 200 years hence, but soon, very soon.
Righteous, brah. I think about that passage a lot. It often appears to me that the actions of the wealthy or the state are deliberate efforts to keep a large population dangling over a cliff of total financial ruin so that they'll be more willing to work difficult, stressful, and dangerous jobs at insultingly low wages. Capitalism spreads poverty like it's manure over a garden of future submissive workers. Here's just one recent example. When it looked like student loan debt forgiveness might actually get passed, all of a sudden, multiple news outlets published opinions that this was a terrible idea for the economy, including the Wall Street Journal, who made the very funny claim that writing off student loan debt is a wealth transferred to the affluent and academia. Hey, that'll teach all the elite bachelor's degree holding Uber Eats delivery people to step down off of their high bikes. That's just one example. Now go and see if you can find your own. Even if you're not an anarchist, you can still look at the news with an anarchist squeak and ask yourself anarchist questions like, if people didn't need to worry about paying off their student loan companies every month, would they still work at their crappy minimum wage job? What if everyone had free universal health care? If people were less precarious in their finances and less worried about being fired, would they be more likely to agitate and try to start unions at their jobs? If we ended poverty, how would that affect the billionaires? And how cool would it look if you sewed a giant Circle A patch on the back of your denim vest? Again, you do not need to be an anarchist to ask yourself these questions. Bringing it back to Michael Malice here for a second, this highlights one of many enormous problems with anarcho-capitalism. Neoliberals, libertarians, and ANCAPs are constantly saying how free we'd all be if we just finally got rid of the state and let the wealthy do whatever they want. But you can't maximize the freedom of all people at the same time you maximize the freedom of capital, who will always lean towards maximizing poverty so as to have a reliable supply of willing workers. This oversight is either because they've been taken in by a fraud ideology that promised them freedom and didn't give them time to think it through, or these people don't really care about human liberty, only the liberty of markets and the freedom of the very rich. For the second group, the fact that their proposed utopian world would make it so much easier to exploit more people to work in worse conditions is actually a plus for them. So at this point, we gotta ask, why the heck would Malice have included such a classic anarcho-communist banger in his right libertarian book? He could have included plenty of sections of the book that don't demonstrate so effectively how misguided Malice's philosophy is. Does he really have the hubris and or the ego? Well, let's take a look at the Rosetta Stone of the Anarchist Handbook, the list of people Malice got to read it. Kropotkin's chapter was read by Yeonmi Park, who you might know is the woman who escaped from North Korea and regularly goes on the telling conservatives what they want to hear tour, appearing on right-wing podcasts and Fox News, always talking about how bad communism is. And if you're curious how bad it is, it's very bad. But not as bad as lefty college campuses and their pronouns.
Wait. Hold it just a second. Even North Korea was not as crazy as American wokeism? Is that what you just said?
Yeah. I mean, at Columbia, they teach you sensitivity training, right? It's mandatory. Of course, in North Korea, we don't have 90 different pronouns.
Getting another ridiculous person like Yeonmi Park for Kropotkin's chapter tells me that Malice is confident anyone reading his book will already have such a negative opinion about communism that just reading Kropotkin's opening lines about how sick it is will cause them to immediately dismiss everything else he says. Murray Rothbard. Murray Rothbard was the original anarcho-capitalist whose full essay, Anatomy of the State, is one of the last sections of Malice's Anarchist Handbook. As mentioned earlier, Murray and his gang of ANCAP pals made a conscious effort to steal terms from the left, and in North America at least, they were successful in redefining libertarian, which once referred to left-wing libertarians only. In Anatomy of the State, Rothbard lays out the game facts stats of the final boss of anarcho-capitalism, the state. States are hard to define, and there are a couple of ways to do it, but Rothbard's definition is especially useful to ANCAPs. From what I understand, he essentially says that the state is different from a corporation in that a state takes what it needs by force and by taxation, which is theft. If a private company became as powerful as the state in every way, it still wouldn't be a state because it would have earned its way there by providing a service and supply and demand, and the cream rises to the top, and the invisible hand and the free market. And I don't really find this convincing personally, but I can see how it would be nice for people who already believe in the benevolent god of capitalism. Just like Rothbard, Michael Malice's cause is to advocate for arguably the most short-sighted political ideology in existence, but that doesn't mean he's not smart. He clearly has a strong belief in something, and he wants to do what he can to change the world to suit that belief. I don't think he's at all honest about what this belief really is, but I can tell you, whatever it is he believes, he really believes it. I think it's interesting that I've seen Malice bring up Emma Goldman in conversation way more times than I've heard him bring up Rothbard. Rothbard may be a handful. He clearly agrees far more with Rothbard than any anarcho-communist. Why doesn't he only talk about him then? There has to be a reason other than the fact that Rothbard is maybe most famous for arguing that parents have the right to sell their children into slavery. Here's my theory. Malice isn't interested in the label anarcho-capitalist because it sucks. An anarcho-capitalist, the thing Michael Malice is but refuses to call himself, is a truly embarrassing thing to be. He calls himself an anarchist without labels. Well, a man who says he's an anything without labels is a man who's ashamed to be called what he is. Hey man, did you just poop your pants? I don't put labels on the things that I do in my pants. And I actually think it's pretty closed-minded to assume that the precise transaction between my bowels and my underwear could even be summed up by mere words. All right, man, well, I'm going to open up a window anyway. He's got his sights set on the word anarchist, okay? He is not after anarcho-capitalist. To spread this definition as far as possible, he sometimes has to be completely dishonest to major figures on the right. One of my favorite examples is this clip with Tim Pool, who is fine with Malice being an anarchist as long as he denounces the evil of Antifa.
In that regard, perhaps I agree with you that they were the precursor to Antifa, which I view as an overtly authoritarian left movement because they attack regular people.
Correct.
So
they would not be in favor of that. Any of the people in this book would not be in favor of that.
Really, dude? None of these people would be in Antifa. You don't think your favorite lady, Emma Goldman, would be down to fight Nazis in the street? I think she'd actually be frustrated by Antifa because they don't go far enough for her. Like, I wonder how Emma Goldman would feel about that time Antifa threw a milkshake at fascist agitator Andy Ngo. The propaganda of the desert. Anarchy is ordering yourself a treat from Dairy Queen. But Malice's goal isn't to be honest about what anarchy is, it's to expropriate the word anarchy from the left. That's also why he wrote a book that includes older left anarchists at the beginning and newer ANCAPs at the end, to draw a single line through all of anarchist thought, stretching from the 19th century socialists through the communists, syndicalists, and moving right into the capitalists, as if that even makes sense as a development.
The original version of anarchism, in the left-wing European tradition, is opposed to domination by one person over another and advocates for a society based on mutual aid and complete equality. The more recent version, the right capitalists, define themselves by opposition to the state.
This is, of course, untrue. There are plenty of real anarchists who are more contemporary. Your David's Graeber, your Noam's Chomsky.
I ended up reading, was it Chomsky's book on anarchism?
Manufacturing Consent? Which
no,
one?
it's another book.
Okay.
Chomsky on, it's like his...
Chomsky's a tough one. That's
yeah,
not the way
and
to
again,
do it.
I struggle with that. I just...
Hey, I have an idea. Let's be bad little babies and read a bit of Chomsky while Michael Malice isn't looking.
Anarcho-capitalism, in my opinion, is a doctrinal system which, if ever implemented, would lead to forms of tyranny and oppression that have few counterparts in human history. There isn't the slightest possibility that it's, in my view, horrendous ideas would be implemented because they would quickly destroy any society that made this colossal error.
Abolish the police. Anarcho-capitalists are sometimes confusing because they often have ideas that at first I think I'd agree with.
The corporate press is the enemy of the people.
So if these elves, the machine elves, are real, and the only way to perceive them is through
DMT or something like that. That doesn't contradict the broader point that they've always been there, and this is the mechanism for perceiving. Every cop is a criminal, without exception. Many of them are nice people.
I'm saying we don't get reform that way. Let's change the laws.
I don't believe in reform. I believe in abolition.
Well, okay,
you want to reform?
You want to abolish the police?
Of course.
So
I did not know that.
Screw bad cops. You got to
There's
change
no
the
good
law,
cops.
man.
There are
You
no
gotta-
good cops.
Okay, fine. All the cops are bad.
Yes.
I think it's.
But let's say this.
One of the most jarring cases of malice whiplash is hearing Michael talk about police abolition. Perfectly reasonable, right? But when you get him into a conversation and let him explain his position, it doesn't go the way you'd expect. Joe Rogan was trying to suss him out one time and asked him what anarchists think about cops.
So anarchists think there should be no cops?
No, anarchists don't think there should be government cops. There should be private security.
Oh, private security. What if you're poor?
What? Well, same thing.
Yes, that's right. We all know the anarchist slogan, all cops are bastards except for private security. Akabeth. It takes a little bit longer to graffiti, but that is the full message. Just kidding. That's a terrible idea. A world where we don't have police, but Jeff Bezos can hire an armed militia to defend his property through violence would be, I'd say, worse than the current situation. He explains his preference for private police in more detail on Lex Friedman's podcast, and it does not get better.
There's no reason why the number I call for my family's being murdered is the same number I call for the fire department, is the same number I call for an ambulance.
Oh, there is a reason, though. It's because it's easier for people to remember the number. I mean, what's your solution?
What if instead it operated like Uber? You had buttons on your phone, guns, flyers, someone's being killed, you press this, and it sends, instead of the one police district, whatever company is nearby, you have a bunch of them, and they're the ones who are going to come to your house to save you.
Michael proposes that since the government police are so bad, not sure why I said that sarcastically, I do agree with that, but he thinks a better way would be to have many competing armed forces roaming your city, answerable to anyone with a data plan. Then, if you're being attacked, you can request a police force, and your attacker can call one up as well. And maybe, in this case, you'll want to spring for the a mercenary plus package. It's more expensive, but the plus guys, they have hollow point bullets, so there's a greater chance of things working well for you in the ensuing gig worker shootout. Awesome. So this all, so far, sounds like a great plan to turn the world we live in into a horrifying nightmare reality, right? Mad Max meets the gig economy, but it seems to legitimately sound good to Michael. The great enemy of all anarcho-capitalists, the state, is one of those things that's kind of hard to define. Well, maybe the simplest definition that still mostly works is the one from German sociologist Max Weber that essentially said a political organization becomes a state when it successfully claims a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. So if the state has a monopoly on violence, you could say Malice is advocating for a free market of violence. But podcast host Lex raises a pretty good point.
A security company, sure, all of those things, they will, as they become successful, start looking more and more like the state. The difference between a government and a very successful service provider in anarchism.
Yeah, what actually happens if some entrepreneur decides to take a small loan from his parents and start a violence company out of his garage, and then years later, he's cornered the violence market and become violence Amazon, shutting out potential competitors and vertically integrating all aspects of the violence industry? Wouldn't that be like functionally exactly the same as a state, but like a horrible authoritarian one? No, it wouldn't. Don't worry. I mean, Malice doesn't disagree that all of that might happen. It's just that he has a different definition for what makes a state than the monopoly on violence idea. He whips out the Murray Rothbard definition from Anatomy of the State.
And Murray Rothbard points out that state is the only agency in a country which gets its goods through force. The only agency that is not a producer, but inherently a parasite because it does not get its money voluntarily, but through taxation.
When a group of hireling knights with a minimalist vector image logo stitched into the front of their Kevlar vests murder your entire family, you can at least take comfort in knowing that according to the Rothbardian definition, there still is no state. Definitely not a state because they don't tax you. Also, since it's a free market system, you can always just open up your app and rate them 1 star. The app company is not liable for what happens if you rate them 1 star while they can see you and what you're doing on your phone. Sounds pretty scary, but Michael Malice has a reason for being so confident in this world.
Like people are like, oh, in an anarchist society, you'd be the first one shot. I'm like, why don't I have the ability to call in my big MMA friends to be like, hey, can you be my housemate?
Oh, cool. You got some big MMA friends who are looking to split the cost of rent? I didn't know you knew Joe Rogan like that. That's cool.
I wouldn't see this as anarchy, because if we had anarchy, we would have peaceful, harmonious trade of capital.
Amen, brother.
And
Luke, come on, don't leave me hanging, Luke.
What we had is government.
But what if you don't have any MMA friends? Are you just supposed to go hang out at CrossFit classes and strike up conversations? Hey, how's it going? See the game last week? By the way, when the state falls, can I move in with you? The reveal. Remember earlier when we went over Michael Malice's catchy slogans to describe anarchy?
The black flag comes in many colors. Anarchism is nothing more than the declaration that you do not speak for me. Everything else is just implementation. Anarchism is not a location. Anarchism is a relationship, one in which none of the parties has authority over the other. Every nation is in an anarchist relationship with one another. If a Canadian kills an American in Mexico, there is some agreed-upon mechanism to adjudicate the situation without involving a higher authority, because there is no higher authority to invoke.
It's that last one there about how all nations are in an anarchist relationship that I'd like to return to now. Everyone, please take the envelope out from under your chair and unseal it. A dove just flew out. So let's break down this idea right off the bat to be 100% clear. All countries are absolutely not in an anarchist relationship with each other because some countries obviously have more power than others. If a Canadian did kill an American in Mexico, I believe the countries would be able to work something out, but the balance of power between them is not equal. Mexico is a poor nation in the global south, Canada is a wealthy settler colonial oil state, and the USA is, of course, the richest country on earth and the official global superpower, and it doesn't really need to listen to anybody about anything. You know, if these three countries had to sort out any kind of a deal together, some kind of, I don't know, let's say free trade agreement of North America, the country most likely to be screwed over is obviously the poorest and least powerful one, Mexico. There's a reason his example doesn't say, what if a Mexican killed a Canadian in America, right? Things would probably go differently. But by now, I certainly hope that we already know Michael Malice isn't advocating for real anarchy. While this metaphor doesn't in any way work for anarchism, it actually works really well as a model to show how anarcho-capitalism is a totally inconsistent bullshit ideology that no one should subscribe to. Follow me on this. Just come with me on this little garden path here, okay? If you think of the nations of the world as people in an ANCAP community, we start out in a little village with enough wealth and food in abundance to provide for everyone. Then, a few people to the north of the community become rich after inventing the cool idea of plundering the wealth of the rest of the community, murdering and enslaving many during the robbery process. Eventually, acting as if in compassion to the desperate poor, the wealthy thieves give their victims tiny amounts of their own plundered wealth back, just enough to keep them alive, and in return ask only that the poor take on debts that are impossible for them to ever pay off. Meanwhile, the rich guys are having a real good time and using their massive wealth to destroy the community's environment. But it's mostly only affecting the poor people, so nothing is really done about it. As the community becomes more and more unlivable and even the rich start to be affected, one brave person has the idea to abolish capitalism and work as one to save the entire community. He is almost instantly stabbed to death. ANCAPs talk a big game about freedom, but who's really free in Michael Malice's Anarchy of Nations? The ones with wealth are free, of course. They have the freedom to enslave, invade, and economically terrorize the non-free nations. If anarchy really is just the application of the statement, "You don't speak for me," why are rich countries so easily able to create systems of domination and control over others? Listen, they can enslave people as long as they don't try to actually speak for them. That's the worst thing. And furthermore, small point here, if nations are in anarchist relationships with each other right now and they don't have a state above them, what do you call it when a bunch of countries form international alliances like the UN or the EU? They have the power to enact sanctions, authorize military action, or even enact laws that apply to groups of countries. Isn't that the sort of higher authority Michael Malice told me countries don't have? Sure, these orgs have absolutely no power to tell a country like the US what to do, but our neoliberal two-tiered justice system constantly fails to hold wealthy people accountable for their actions. Every time Elon Musk breaks the law and nothing happens to him, is that anarchy, according to Michael Malice? Is the freedom of anarcho-capitalism really just freedom for billionaires? And if so, don't we already kind of have that? But maybe I'm being unfair. I'm definitely looking at the relationship between countries of the world from clearly a biased left-wing view of global history. It's very possible, in fact, it's guaranteed, that Michael Malice sees things quite differently. To really understand what he means by the anarchist relationship between countries, let's listen to Michael Malice's thoughts on foreign policy. So here he is on Fox News discussing what should be done about Palestine.
The way to stop one of these cultures that's based on violence and aggression is to bomb them back into the Stone Age, and that's the only way to keep this kind of thing from happening again. It's been happening for 70 years. You could have ceasefires all you want, but until these people are beaten into submission, this is going to keep happening.
Michael is specifically talking about Gaza, an open-air prison, the most densely populated area of the world, full of people displaced from their ancestral land and homes and forbidden to return, entirely under the control of a foreign settler government that does not grant them equal rights based on the color of their skin and their religion. His solution to the problem of Gaza is to openly call for total genocide. This is such an extreme view that it's even a little far for Fox News.
Let's bring that into this. You've listened
thanks
to.
for that.
You're welcome. I mean, it's getting kind of tense.
So this is what Michael Malice is talking about when he says that all countries are in an anarchist relationship with each other. No country is higher up than any other. They all have the equal ability to perform ethnic cleansing on the poorest and most oppressed people on earth. Another guest pushes back just a little bit on Michael's line about bombing them back into the Stone Age, and the host jumps in to lightly remind Malice that the people of Gaza are very poor. Listen to what Malice says in response.
One question I have about the Stone Age thing, besides the
Is it there already?
Well, they're there already,
I mean,
but
that's
also
kind of, it's a good point. They are not a very wealthy people. Not that the point of the conflict is to make them wealthy. Go ahead.
Well, poverty's not an accomplishment.
Poverty is not an accomplishment. So let me see if I now understand. For Michael Malice, the relationship Israel or the United States has with Palestine represents the ideal relationship individual humans could have with one another in an anarchist society. Yes, the very poor will be completely vulnerable to violence at all times, but remember, poverty is not an accomplishment. It's a sign of weakness. So no, this is not the ideology of anarchism. This is the simple ideology of might makes right. In conclusion, fuck this piece of shit anarcho wannabe. I don't know if the definition of anarchy is you do not speak for me, but maybe one way to define an anarchist would be anyone who would say you do not speak for me after listening to more than 30 seconds of Michael Malice. Malice isn't an anarchist without adjectives. I can think of plenty of adjectives for him. Here's one: bad. You look like if MCU Hawkeye was from a parallel dimension where everyone has a lesbian haircut. You look like a little elf that sneaks into houses at night and cuts holes in the N95 masks. You're small and uncomfortable, but you're also kind of weirdly jacked. Like, how do you look like an abusive gym teacher and the depressed student he bullies? Michael Malice is an anarchist like Mikhail Peterson is a vegan. I'm living the vegan lifestyle now that I've officially given up dairy and I only eat steaks. Michael Malice loves to put on costumes. He's like if Mr. Dress-Up told kids to read Milton Friedman. Here he is, dressed up as how capitalists see poor people. And I don't think this is a Kim Jong-un costume. I think it's just the outfit that appears on your body if you have that hairstyle for a long enough time. He wore this to the Rubin Report to protest mask mandates. I believe this character is called If Slender Man Was a Magician Pickup Artist. Also, bro, you can't call yourself an anarchist if you keep quoting Atlas Shrugged. You're an Anarchist. Speaking of which, why don't we end this essay about Michael Malice the same way Harvey Pekar ended his graphic novel about Michael Malice, with an inspirational Ayn Rand quote.
I disapprove of, disagree with, and have no connection with the latest aberration of some conservatives, the so-called hippies of the right, who attempt to snare the younger or more careless ones of my readers by claiming simultaneously to be followers of my philosophy and advocates of anarchism. Anyone offering such a combination confesses his inability to understand either.